Almost there. There we go. All right. Well, we'll just give it, just a few more minutes to let people, or not minutes, but, moments, let people log in through YouTube that are going to be doing that, people coming through Zoom that are a bit late, and then we will get up and running. Hopefully everybody who is joining us for this episode of Niddah has already gone back through the first of our series, because Niddah has a lot of backstory, underlying concepts, and that's why we spent almost all of last week talking about them, and they're going to continue to be useful. So make sure you've got that foundation. Of course, you're welcome to still join us, even if this is your first time and you're watching live. But if you've got the option to hit pause because you're watching this as the recording, then go back and watch the first episode of Niddah. You really need that information to make sense of where we're going. All right, I'm going to open it up before we dive into the new material to see if there are any lingering questions from anyone before we start. Okay, not seeing anyone hitting unmute or typing in YouTube. So let's jump in. Okay, so here we are in Mishnah number 2. And yeah, that's as far as we got last time. We only got one Mishnah officially on the board. I think we'll probably have a bit of a better pace than one Mishnah for tonight. And we are continuing with the concept of the retroactive or potential retroactive issue of once the woman notices that she has begun her menstrual cycle, once the discharge of the uterine blood has been discovered. So how does, and then Dr. Kolp is putting some things in brackets to make the sentence work easier for us. How does the rule that it suffices to reckon her period of uncleanness for the time she discovers the flow work? As he points out, we are talking here about a veset. This is a woman who has a regular cycle, meaning that it is on a very particular timetable or a very particular set of symptoms that come as like clockwork to let her know that this is when the time of her period will be. So if a woman has that cycle, meaning that regular of a cycle, then we do not require any retroactive reckoning of her uncleanness back to the final examination or up to 24 hours, as we talked about in Mishnah 1. But we still need to fine-tune what exactly do we mean by that? How does it then work? What is the implication? Get my mouse so it doesn't scroll too loudly. If she was sitting on a bed and was occupied with ritually clean objects, okay, two very important topics. The sitting impurity is a very important topic in Jewish law, and one especially connected to the issue of Niddah. And then these ritually clean objects, tohorot, these are objects that are not only ritually clean, but need to be ritually clean. And so, of course, they have a special focus as well. So we're putting both of these together in order to discuss what the implication is. So even if she was sitting on a bed, even if she was occupied with a ritually clean object, then she leaves the bed, she stands up, and she sees the flow. She is unclean, but the objects are clean. So there is a what you might consider a leniency here, although I, as you've probably all noticed by now, I prefer the term a ruling, neither lenient nor strict, but merely what the rabbis observe to be the proper interpretation, which is, yes, she was on the bed a minute ago, and she's just stood up. And even though we might interpret the fact that she has just now discovered that her cycle has begun, we don't have to assume retroactively that she was indeed already in the midst of her cycle while sitting on the bed. As such, the bed or the object she was handling, the ritually clean, the tohorot, do not take on a retroactive change of status to become ritually impure. So the rabbis are saying that if you are a type of woman that has this very regular pattern to her cycle, then we do not require any retroactive buffering. And in fact, even up to and including these two very important topics that happened immediately before the discovery, even in this case, we are not backlogging any of that as having become ritually impure. Now, this is, as I mentioned, just for the Veset, the woman that has this very regular and dependable period. We will talk more about how to define that later on in the Masechet. But for now, just keep it as, in your mind, a category of regularly defined and predictable. Okay, question? Make sense? Okay, and then we get the other end, right? So the first half of the Mishnah is talking about the past, and the next part of the Mishnah is talking about the future. Even though they have said that she conveys uncleanness for a period of 24 hours retroactively, and here, as Dr. Kopagin points out, and all the commentaries point out, the Mishnah is referring to a woman that is not a Veset, that is not with a regular cycle, even though in that case, like we talked about back in Mishnah 1, that there is a retroactive uncleanness that goes when she does discover it, up to 24 hours or up until her last checking. Nonetheless, she counts the 7 days of her menstruation only from the time she observed the flow. and my throat's getting a lot better than it was last Shabbat, but I still need to clear it from time to time, so bear with me. So what the Mishnah is saying here is that in the category of a woman who doesn't have this regular predictable period, for whom we have said we will log the period as though it began a day before, or at least up to that, depending upon when her last examination was, we do not count that day before as actually being one of the 7 days of Niddah, one of the 7 days of the monthly cycle. So she still has to count from the time she discovers that her period has begun. She has to count those 7 days until she has finished that Niddah cycle. So we are adding in an impurity on the back end, that 24 hours before, but that doesn't count for the overall clock ticking for her 7 days. Questions or comments? All right. Wow. It's a little more complicated. Don't worry. Mishnah number 3. Rabbi Eliezer says, there are 4 types of women for whom it suffices to reckon their period of uncleanness from the time of their discovering the flow. All right, so we talked about a woman who doesn't have a set period and the retroactive establishment of impurity for her. We talked about the woman with the Veset who has a regular period and the fact that we don't need a retroactive period of uncleanness, but instead we count from the moment of discovery, from when she sees it. Well, now we're going to introduce 4 additional categories of women that follow that basic idea of the second category. That is to say, these 4 women count and do not retroactively add any uncleanness from the moment that they discover. When they discover, everything afterwards can become ritually impure, but everything before, no status change at all. So they are very much like a woman with the Veset. Okay, so what are these 4 types of women? They are a virgin, a pregnant woman, a nursing woman, and an old woman. We are going to define all of these in the subsequent Mishnayot. So I'm not going to go into depth right now, because some of those you're probably scratching your head about a little bit of how that works. But we will discuss them in much more detail. But right now, the basic idea is, as I've tried to say, that if a pregnant woman, a virgin, a nursing woman, or an old woman, as soon to be defined by the Mishnah, if they see that they are now having an emission of that blood, then they are considered to be in a state of tum'ah, that there is ritual impurity from that moment of discovery going forward. They don't have to retroactively figure out what they came into contact with and what they might have rendered ritually impure in the past. The basic idea makes sense. Like I said, the definitions are coming. Okay. Rabbi Joshua says, I have only heard the ruling applied to a virgin, but the halacha is in agreement with Rabbi Eliezer. This is a fascinating passage here at the end, and the commentaries have a number of different ways to read it. So we're going to read it first in the style of Dr. Kolb here, and then I'll give you an alternative reading as well. So Dr. Kolb reads this as being a very interesting deviation from the usual form, which is to say that Rabbi Eliezer is somebody that is often a very strict traditionalist, meaning that he is often narrowing the tradition based upon what he has received, his received oral tradition, the Shmuah, what he has heard with his own ears. That is what he often will focus on. And Rabbi Joshua tends to be more expansive of applying the tradition in a way that broadens categories. But here, Rabbi Joshua seems to be doing the opposite. He is saying the only ruling I've actually heard, meaning that I was taught when I was a student, was that this applied to the virgin, that from the virgin, for the virgin, when she discovers the flow, it's from that moment of discovery onward for impurity, there's no retroactivity. But despite having heard that, in this version of how the Mishnah should be read, he agrees, Rabbi Joshua agrees, that the halacha is in agreement with Rabbi Eliezer. So he establishes that should be the correct ruling, despite the fact that he has only heard the virgin as the core. Now, there's another way to rule this, which is to say that these two sentences, I have only heard with regards to a virgin, and the halacha is in agreement with Rabbi Eliezer, those could be separate statements. The Rabbi Joshua statement, I've only heard regarding a virgin, that could be just Rabbi Joshua's statement, and coming, as we often see, a counterpoint to the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. And then the stama, the anonymous voice of the Mishnah, the editor, if you will, adds in his own commentary, which is to say, but Rabbi Joshua is wrong in this. Instead, the halacha goes with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, we don't often get the voice of the Mishnah ruling one way or the other. That's usually something that happens more in the Talmud. But this may have been a special case. Indeed, there were other commentaries on this that argue that it's all the voice of Rabbi Joshua, but we have a timeline that's actually unfolding here. Rabbi Eliezer, some of you may remember, was very famous with the story of Tanur Shel Achnai, and was ostracized, was put under an official ban by the congregation, by the community, for failing to agree to follow the rulings of the majority within the court. And as such, his rulings were not permitted to be used. They were not ruled upon. They were not allowed to be used by the Beit Din, because you would then be transmitting interpretations, knowledge, traditions from somebody that was rejecting the fundamental point of Rabbinic Judaism of working with the community. However, Rabbi Joshua agrees with Rabbi Eliezer that the four categories are probably the right four categories, but could not make that statement while Rabbi Eliezer was still alive or under that ban, because to do so might make people accept other ideas of Rabbi Eliezer. And so this could only be implemented and only be put into place once that was no longer the case. And then we finish off with Rabbi Eliezer, his four categories are actually the right four categories. So that may be more of the discussion of the different commentaries than you were looking for. The basic rule is the four categories are the ones that stand when we get to actual halacha. But I personally enjoy these digressions, not only among different commentators, but also some of the making of the rabbinic rules of how the rabbis had the push and take, not only in the debate, but in the broader communal aspects. All right, I'll pause there and have a little sip of tea and soothe
So
the vocal.
those four categories, like a virgin, a pregnant woman, nursing woman, and old woman, is for what? Sorry.
So these women are ones that, when they discover that there is a flow, then they mark that moment as being the beginning of the tum'ah, the ritual impurity, and then go forward. whereas another woman who doesn't have a regular period, another woman who's, some days it's this, some months it's this, some months it's that, when she notices the flow, Mishnah 1 told us that we have to retroactively assume that her flow had already begun at least or at most 24 hours, or at least as far back as her most recent examination. So there is a stringency for those women, and that stringency does not apply to these 4 women. These 4 categories do not have that stringency.
And usually 7 days, correct, by the rabbi, the period?
Well, for a period that is a Niddah, yes, it's 7 days. If it's a Zava, if it is an irregular emission, then it is, you have to wait until the flow stops and then count 7 clean days, which, as I talked about in my introduction last week, the difference between Niddah and Zava is often lost in the modern application of these family purity topics. But the Mishnah preserves the Torah version and preserves the early rabbinic version. It was during the Talmudic period that things began to change. But we will continue through the Mishnah to make that distinction. But here they're just talking not about how long will she be ritually impure. They are talking about whether there was any retroactive application of impurity to items that she was in contact with prior to her discovery of the flow. Aaron?
Yes, Rabbi. Just out of curiosity, when you were talking about Rabbi Eliezer being ostracized, that means during this time, this group of the court was not pluralistic, right? Because I remember 2 Shabbats ago, we in the conservative movement in general has advocated for a pluralistic mindset.
Right. So during the time of the Great Sanhedrin, there absolutely were rulings that were being applied in order to create consistency within the people of Israel. Now that Sanhedrin ruled by the authority that has been passed down, or I should say had been passed down by the direct line of smicha that went all the way back to Moses. And that created a authority for the Sanhedrin that is not equaled by other courts that have come since. So although you can certainly have a court that will make a decision for the local community, it does not have the authority to make decisions for all of the Jewish people. And as such, we are living in a time now of pluralism because there is no official Sanhedrin. It's a whole nother conversation about how an official Sanhedrin could ever be reconvened. There have been a couple attempts historically. None of them have worked out. But that's something that, in my opinion, we'll wait for Mashiach to sort out for us. And at that point, we don't need to be defending pluralism per se, because Mashiach will set everything right and we'll all agree. And if we don't all agree, then it's not Mashiach yet. Judaism has always been proof is in the pudding for the Messiah. The Messiah is not just our favorite, candidate. The Messiah is the one who actually accomplishes what needs to be accomplished. And if the Messiah cannot help reconcile differences of opinion within the Jewish people, then how is the Messiah going to reconcile differences of opinion among all the peoples of earth? So yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. But in the meantime, it would be presumptuous to act as though any one group had a monopoly on authority to impose their interpretation upon every other aspect of every other Jewish community. They simply lack the authority. They may have the will, they may have the desire, they may even feel they have the best arguments. But if you cannot win in the field of argumentation, there is no authority to impose that ruling upon anyone other than those who choose to follow it. It's It's what I like to call, in Judaism, we have a very soft dictatorship, which is to say that the rabbinic authority is as strong and as far-reaching as the people want to let it be. If the people of a synagogue like their rabbi's rules, then that rabbi continues to be their rabbi. He continues to work at their synagogue, and they get along just fine. If the people of the town all like the same rabbi, then great. The town can follow that rabbi's rules. If the people of the country like that rabbi, great. The whole country can follow that rabbi's rules. But if another town, another city doesn't like that, the rabbi of the first city has no authority to impose his decisions upon them. He can argue a great deal, which is why the whole chief rabbi model was granted, pushed upon us by mostly foreign governments, and has created a lot of problems.
But Rabbi, just out of curiosity though, isn't the reform movement individualistic? So the rabbis really not making any decisions?
They are, although I will point out that although the official early reform platform was very much about the rights of the individual and keeping with the most, shall we say, effervescent ideas of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, that doesn't mean that that's normally the case. If you go to any reform congregation and someone gets up and starts to, do something in the service very differently than others, they will absolutely still be pressured into conforming with the community or finding a different community to be a part of that fits their practice. So yes, there may be on paper a great deal more emphasis on the individual, but community-wide, even in the Reform congregations, they still have a congregational standard that is usually reinforced. It's the old joke that no political party is ever an absolute purist when it comes to their platform statements, and that goes for religious denominations as well. All right, Mishnah number 4. Let's get to our definitions because they need it. Who is regarded as a virgin? All right, now you may think this is a rather silly question because after all, the word virgin, betula, this is a technical term that means a woman who has not had intercourse, right? No, not
depending,
here.
Because could be accidents.
Well, so first of all, even that definition, a woman who has a certain accident or certain types of accidents and no longer has the physical mark of virginity, even in those cases, she might still be considered a virgin by Jewish law, even though the hymen is no longer intact. But here we are getting a completely other definition of the word virgin, which is just for the topic of Niddah. Aaron, you got your hand up. So
yeah, I think you answered it. So this is completely different than what we learned the definition was in Ketubah, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. So this is different than our discussion of what is in a ketubah or other topics of virginity. This is a virgin for Niddah. And what is the definition? Any woman who has never yet observed a blood flow, even if she is married. Okay, so this means you could have a woman and she is married and she has had relations with her husband, yet she has not yet begun to have a cycle of menstruation. Now, does that mean that she was getting married super young? No, not necessarily, because we live now in a time when menstruation is coming quite early for many young women, but in the classical world, in the pre-modern world, really, menstruation would not necessarily begin right at the age of 12 or puberty as we classically define it, and there could be many other factors that will delay or postpone a woman beginning to have menstruation. So this doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about a child bride. And as we've talked about before, the rabbinic teachings are very much opposed to getting married to a super young woman. It's not something that is considered a great idea, and generally it is strongly discouraged. Even in some circumstances where it might be technically permissible, it is still absolutely frowned upon by the tradition. But here we're not talking necessarily about a young woman. We just mean a woman who has not yet had menstruation. So she is a Niddah virgin. She is not a sexual virgin. And as such, if she is a woman who has never had a cycle, and then she gets her first cycle, from that moment, we don't have to think, well, maybe her cycle began yesterday. Instead, she follows that same rule that we saw from Mishnah 2, which is her cycle begins at the moment that she sees it. And we don't have to retroactively make anything else ritually impure. Natan, I think I see your hand.
Yes, and just I keep thinking about the comments. What was the definition version by Ketubah?
That is the more sexual definition of virgin. That barring an accident, it means a woman who has not yet had relations with a man.
Yes, that's the one. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a Niddah virgin. Like I said, very particular topic. One that would only happen once in a woman's life, because once she'd had menstruation even once, this category would no longer apply. Even if there was a long period in between for environmental, health, or other reasons that she stopped, if she'd had menstruation once, she is still a menstruant and doesn't go back into that Niddah virgin category. Woman number 2, a woman in pregnancy. Well, what does a woman in pregnancy mean? Because as we know, even in the modern world, noticing when the pregnancy begins is sometimes a little tricky. Well, here the definition that the rabbis are giving is one whose fetus is noticed, which is about 3 months in, is the rough area for when that means she is pregnant. Now, you may be scratching your head and saying, well, hold on a second. But how can a woman who's pregnant have a Niddah or Zava discharge? Because she's pregnant, and a miscarriage would be a very different type of discharge, as we will cover in more detail. So is this what's going on here? And now is as good a time as any to simply lay out a very important one important fact, which is the rabbis did not have all the medical facts in the ancient world. This is controversial in some circles. I highly recommend Natan Slifkin's work on this topic. He's written a great book on rationalism and mysticism in Jewish thinking. But there is a basic issue, which is that the rabbis did not understand everything about the biology of the human body. They did amazing with what they had, and their rules are still our rules, but the underlying concerns they had about certain things seem to have been based, in some cases, and we shouldn't be too quick to judge, on a lack of anatomical, biological knowledge. So can there be uterine bleeding in the way of Niddah during a pregnancy? No, unless it's a miscarriage, then it's a miscarriage. But apart from that, the normal things that the rabbis were worried about on the monthly cycle are not occurring during the pregnancy cycle. This is going to become even more apparent as we get into our topic of the nursing woman, our category number 3. So what is a nursing woman? Until she has weaned her child. Now, this was generally done for 24 months in the classical world, that a toddler up to the age of 24 would still be eating from his mother, even as solid foods might have also been introduced. And the fact that they have some questions about exactly why this would be the case of the Niddah implications is going to be a little bit clearer after we look at the argument at the bottom here. If she gave her child to a nursing woman, meaning she hired a wet nurse or had a relative or friend that was wet nursing, Either she couldn't because of health or other issues, or for whatever reason. So someone else is doing the actual nursing, and she is not. So if she gave her child to a nursing woman, if she weaned him, or if he died, Rabbi Meir says she conveys uncleanness retroactively for 24 hours. So Rabbi Meir says, hold on. When we say weaned, we should also remember that if she lets someone else nurse the child instead of her, or if the baby dies, that she now goes back into the category of being a regular woman with no defined menstruation cycle. And as such, when she finally notices any emission, we have to retroactively go back 24 hours, give or take the examination, and that's how she should be treated. But the sages, on the other hand, say no, it suffices for her to reckon her period of uncleanness from the time of her observation of the flow. Even if she weaned the child, even in fact, if the child died, or if another woman is nursing, she has 24 months in which the first emission that she notices is considered to be as though she were still nursing. Now, why? Well, actually, I'll pause about the why on that. Aaron, if you have a question about the technical ruling.
No, a nursing woman, that only refers to your own child, right?
Yes. This is talking about the woman who gave birth to the child, the actual birth mother. And thank you for that clarification, because that is a good lead into what's going on here. So the rabbis of the day, really the medical authorities of the day, were not 100% sure why it was that when a woman was nursing, she tended not to resume her normal cycle immediately, which is true. That is to say, biologically to this day, while a woman is still weaning a child, while she is still breastfeeding, it tends to suppress, diminish, delay, increase irregularity. Every woman is different, of course, but it definitely is less common for a woman who is nursing her child to have her period. And the rabbis were trying to figure out why. Well, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion, within the medical establishment, that the act of nursing is what creates the difference. Some of the ancient authorities in the other medical world would say that the act of nursing is transforming the blood that would normally go into the uterus and turning it into milk and other such non-accurate medical renderings. But they basically thought that it was the act of nursing, the physical act of nursing and the producing of milk, that prevented the cycle from resuming. And so, of course, like Rabbi Meir agrees, if she's not nursing anymore, then we have to assume that her cycle is going to begin fairly soon, and she should thus be treated like any other woman, not like a nursing woman. The sages, on the other hand, seem to be following the opinion that when a woman gives birth, there is a fundamental bodily change that will affect her for about 2 years, regardless of whether she actually nurses the child or not. And as such, we should just assume that her first resumption of menstruation is this sort of clean resumption, and we don't need to consider any retroactive implications. Now, like I said, both of these are kind of fundamental, based on kind of fundamentally bad biology, but the ruling still stands. The ruling being that for 24 months, the very first menstruation that she has is still considered to be this clean resumption, and we don't need any retroactive application of Tumah, because the ruling is one that was essentially agreed upon. It was the underlying biology that was creating a disagreement about how it should be applied in these other cases, and as such, we keep the ruling, even as we recognize that some of the other elements of this argument are probably not based on scientifically viable principles. Yes, Aaron.
So how come in the first 40 or 80 days, the blood's considered pure no matter what?
Because again, this is based on a rabbinic idea that the early formation of the fetus is not biologically significant. And as such, it doesn't have an implication. That's why an early miscarriage is not treated the same as a late-term miscarriage. A late-term miscarriage is generally treated as a birth, whereas an early-term miscarriage is not.
I thought it was
Go ahead.
No, I thought it was the first 40 or 80 days after birth.
Oh, so the first 40 and 80 days after birth. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the early type. So the first 40 or 80 days after birth, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit more tonight, is actually based upon the special instructions given in Tazria, where we find out that after a boy is born, there is a 7-day delay, and then the woman goes into a period of 33 days of purity, meaning that any blood that's seen is considered to come from the birth and not considered to be menstruation. And for a girl, after a 14-day period, any blood for the next 66 days, if I got the math right, yes, 66 days is likewise considered to be from the birth and not to be from the menstruation. But that is a explicit ruling in the Torah, and so we need not worry about the underlying science of it. Instead, we apply the mitzvah as transmitted.
Rabbi, sorry, just to clarify something, is there an 80-day rule for the miscarriage, or is it just 40 days flat out?
So it depends on the term of where the miscarriage happens. If it happens at a point when we can determine the gender of the child, then we follow the ruling of the gender. If it happened earlier than that, but still after the point where the actual fetus could be observed in the miscarriage, then it would be in that gray area. Good?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Mishnah number 5, leaving the most controversial one for last. What is an old woman? Okay, so the rabbis are introduced this concept back in our earlier Mishnah that an old woman too, if she has an emission, we assume that it is a clean resumption, and we do not retroactively add any time to the ritual impurity. We just start counting and applying that impurity from that moment. But like the other 3 categories, we have to define what is an old woman. It can't just be what I feel is an old woman, right? Any woman over whom 3 onot have passed near the time of old age. All right, so this may still seem a little unsatisfactory, but the rabbis are doing the best they can with what still in the modern world is a difficult situation to medically diagnose. Menopause and perimenopause, the end of a woman's monthly cycles, is not easy to establish with a laser-like precision. It's not like you just throw a switch and then everything is different from that point forward. Instead, the rabbis are saying, look, we know that menopause will eventually happen, and we know that the cycle eventually stops with a woman when she reaches some age, some older age, but we're not going to assume that a youngish woman, let's say in her 20s, has entered menopause just because she missed 3 periods. Because a woman might miss 3 periods for any number of additional environmental, health, or other reasons. So they are putting together a 2-factor criteria. 1, she has to miss 3 periods, right? You miss a period and you're 60 years old. If you've only missed 1 period, we don't assume that you are basically in the category of being a, quote, old woman when you then resume at the next time. At your 2nd period. And 2, you have to actually be old-ish. Like I said, a 20-year-old that misses 3 periods is not considered to be somebody who is in this old woman category. There is another discussion in the Talmud that gives a little bit more sociological definition which is an old woman, meaning a woman who's in old age, is defined by somebody that everyone can call Ima, and she doesn't get upset. Meaning that it's, if everybody calls her mother in a very matronly kind of way, meaning a very respectful, deferential, we all think of you just as being a mother and no longer as being a woman likely to be getting likely to be in the social pool of those that are active in younger ways, and she doesn't mind being called that, then that would also be a great indication that she has passed that age of she's okay with being old. It's kind of an interesting look at, sometimes you're old when you don't mind being called old, and you respect and recognize that that's not an insult. But unfortunately, I think we all know that for a large portion of people's lives, both men and women can often have a chip on their shoulder about being called old. And it shouldn't be considered an insult. And that's something that's only become a worse problem in the modern era, when we idolize youth and youthful style consumption and behavior far more than we value the insights and wisdom of those people that might be considered old. Yes, Natan.
Why? From where come that argument about what does mean an old woman? Like we are in something different, and they jump to this topic.
No.
Any breach?
No. We were back in Mishnah 3. There are four types of women.
The four things.
Exactly. Virgin,
Okay.
pregnant, nursing, old.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah,
Good,
it's not out of left field. The actual break of each of the Mishnayot, there is some discussion and debate in different passages. I haven't seen anything specifically about this, but some lines, some Mishnayot will sometimes be divided in two different editions, and there'll be one in a separate edition. Sometimes a line or two will move from the end of one to the beginning of another. So yeah, it's kind of jarring, because Mishnah 5 is basically a continuation of Mishnah 4, which was basically a continuation of Mishnah 3. But we have to divide the paragraph somewhere, and this is where this paragraph was divided.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Mishnah 5 continues. Rabbi Eliezer says, for any woman over whom have passed 3 onot, it suffices, meaning to reckon her period of uncleanness the time of her observing the flow. So Rabbi Eliezer wants to be very, very broad in definition, and say it doesn't matter about virgin, pregnant, nursing. If the woman goes through 3 periods and has not seen any sign of flow, then it's like hitting the reset button on her. And it doesn't matter whether she's old or not. She could be a 20-year-old, she could be a 50-year-old, she could be an 80-year-old. You miss 3 slots, you now are considered a clean resumption, and we only consider Tumah from that point forward. The rabbis, of course, are concerned that in general, there is an expectation, all other things being the same, that there will be a monthly cycle. And so they are reluctant to say, just because you miss 3, we're not expecting a 4. And when the 4 comes, it's like a clean surprise. That's why the rabbis are essentially rejecting Rabbi Eliezer's position. Rabbi Yossi has another variation. He says, for a woman in pregnancy and a nursing woman over whom 3 onot have passed, it suffices to reckon their period of uncleanness from the time of their observation of the flow. So Rabbi Yossi is making it a little bit stricter than the sages, and say, no. Just because she's pregnant doesn't mean that we don't consider it as being potentially retroactively causing Tumah. Instead, she has to go through 3 missed periods before that is triggered. And likewise, just because she's nursing doesn't mean that we consider it to be a clean restart when she finally observes. Instead, we should wait for those 3 missed periods during the nursing, and then say now any flow is going to be a clean resumption. But both of those opinions are not picked up by the majority, or neither of those opinions are picked up. Okay. Mishnah number 6. All right.
So I was just trying to think a little, okay? I'm a little hungry, so I cannot think very sharply, okay, to be honest with you. We are talking about Truma because they have kind of the menstruation, correct? Not because Truma, because Sava or something else.
Well, no, it could be, right? So far, we have not determined or talked about in the Mishnah about the difference between a sighting, a discovery, a seeing of blood that would be from a Zava or a Niddah. We talked about that in my introduction last week, but the Mishnah hasn't gone into that yet. So right now, we're not figuring out how to tell the difference between one or the other. Instead, we are talking about she's discovered blood. She's discovered the blood. Now, which blood it is, well, that will kind of make a difference if it was, not at the time that she was expecting, the issue of the Veset, the woman who has the regular period. Then yes, if it was not at the time she was expecting, then we're going to have a different set of rules. But otherwise, what we're talking about here is blood. And they're saying if she sees blood, then we know that she is ritually impure at this moment, the moment she discovers it. But was she impure the day before and she just didn't notice it? Was it already beginning internally, but which suffices to begin the process. And when we get to the discussion of how to do an examination, it does involve the internal element. So does it mean she was retroactively impure for the previous 24 hours or not? And that would be the same whether or not it was a Zava or a Niddah. The retroactivity is the same. Excuse me. Okay, so mission number 6. We've been talking about this retroactive impurity, and we were talking about it with regards to her observing the flow, that she has discovered the bleed, and we have also talked about for some women, namely the Veset, and then namely also the 4 women that were in that special category, that it would suffice, meaning that the impurity would only begin from the moment of observation. However, especially with regards to the category of 4, there needs to be a little bit more definite. We have to refine that a little bit, qualify it. And of what did they speak when they said it suffices for them to reckon their period of uncleanness from the time of their discovery or their flow? Like, give me some extra details here. This refers to the first observation, but after a second observation, she defiles retroactively for a period of 24 hours. So let's use the example of the woman that is nursing, because that's sort of a nice generic sort of situation. So the woman is nursing. She's been nursing for 8 months. And after 8 months, all of a sudden, she sees blood, right? And she's like, well, it looks like it is starting up again. Well, at that 8-month first observation, that moment becomes the moment of ritual impurity. And, she goes through the normal process of observing how much blood, what type of blood, and all of the other details that the rest of the Masechet will deal with. But we don't add any impurity from the day before. We don't say, but she sat on that sofa, or she was touching that truma, or anything like that. We say, no. Her impurity begins from the moment of discovery and it goes forward. However, let's imagine that goes through and she finishes that flow of whatever type it is, and she finishes the mikvah and all of that. And then a month later, so now we're in month 9 of nursing, she has another sign of bleeding. With that one, it's the second observation, and now we are going to put her in the category of adding on that 24 hours to the previous from the previous day for applying ritual impurity to things she might have come into contact with. All right. I think I saw a hand go up and down. Did I answer your question, or?
Kind of, Rabbi. How come she goes into the 24-hour period instead of Niddah?
No.
The cycle hasn't been established?
No, the 24-hour period here isn't of how long she is ritually impure.
It's retroactive.
It's the retroactive. It's the yesterday 24 hours.
Right, but if once she establishes her cycle, though, that 24 hours doesn't exist, right?
Well, okay, so then yes, there's the wrinkle I think you're going for is if going back to our nursing mother, she has 8 months without any observed flow, and then in the 8th month she begins to resume her menstruation, and it becomes again like clockwork. Then once it has been established, it can go back to it suffices, meaning that she's like a Veset, clockwork system, and we don't add the 24-hour retroactive period. But it takes a time to establish that the pattern is regular again.
Is it 3 months? Okay.
Yeah, we're going to get to that eventually in the Masechah, but yes, the short answer is 3 months of regularity is what it takes. So the second one, by definition, is not going to be a regular one because it's only number 2. So that can't be a Veset. It cannot be it suffices. This one would, by definition, need to have the 24-hour retroactively added to it. Good?
Yes. Good.
Okay. All right. And the second half of Mishnah 7.
Question, sorry, before
yeah.
continuation. Are you sure, Rabbi, that we didn't study that before? Because everything sounds so familiar. I remember the different kind of blood that need to be more with more mass. That if it's very liquid, it's not. I remember all this. Are you sure that we didn't study this Masechet?
I am sure we have not studied Niddah together. Maybe you studied it on your own time. Maybe you studied some summaries of the halacha on your own, which Yasher Koach, great. We've touched on some of these ideas of different types of blood when we did ketubot, especially with regards to virginity. But I don't remember studying all of those elements. Now, you might have also read one of many people's first introductions to some of the issues actually comes if you study Masechet Brachot, because there is a very famous passage in the beginning, and I'm blanking on the daf, that talks about David HaMelech, about King David, about him being a one who would study and help examine the miscarriage, the blood, the mass, to establish whether or not it was in the early portion or later portion. So if you studied Masechet Brachot with a more extensive commentary, they might have talked about that issue there as well.
Maybe.
And Tom, just so you know, I thought the same thing when I first started reading this, but as we get into detail, I don't think we've read it before.
Okay.
Now, it does also touch on a lot of the topics of purity, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to study it, as well as the fact that it is one of the most relevant areas of purity in the modern world. So it's not surprising if you feel some familiarity with this, but I can guarantee we have not studied the Masechet together.
Okay, I trust you.
I'm getting old, but I'm not that old yet. Okay, and then there is another wrinkle. If she saw the first flow on account of an accident, even it suffices for her subsequent the translation's a little clunky here. If she saw the first flow on account of an accident, even a subsequent observation is reckoned for her uncleanliness from the time of her observing the flow. It suffices, right? So what it's saying here is, let's imagine she had a fall, or the sages also talk about a great fright. She's scared, and she bleeds from that part of her body. Well, if we know that she's bleeding from that part of the body because of this other problem, then that doesn't count as her first while being in this category of 4 women. Instead, the second time she sees blood while being in the category of these 4 women, that counts as the first one, which means no retroactive application of ritual impurity. So it's like she gets a pass on the first bleed, because we know that it was not a menstrual bleed. It was instead because of some external factor. All right, and we're going to finish off Mishnah 7 so we can finish the chapter. Okay. Although they said that a woman who has a regular period, one who it's always coming at the same time or always with a very clear pattern of symptoms, it suffices to reckon her period of uncleanness from the time she observes a flow. She should nevertheless examine herself, meaning regularly, except for a menstruant or one who is sitting over pure blood. Okay, so let's imagine you are a woman and you have this regular cycle, and you are like clockwork. It's going to be on the day number 18 every single month of the calendar. It's day 18. It's been that way for 20 years. Okay. Nevertheless, you still examine, which we will talk about in more detail when we get into the later chapters. But she should still examine to see, maybe there is blood inside and I missed it. Even though she doesn't have the symptoms, even though it's not her day, she should still, routinely check just in case, because there are other causes for an emission. It may not be her actual menstruation. There could be some other bleed, and she should keep an eye on that too. So it's kind of like saying she shouldn't be so complacent, even if she is exceptionally regular. Except if she is a menstruant. Well, I mean, if she's actually in the middle of her menstruation, what is she examining? She's menstruating. And that means she doesn't need to check. Like I said before, this is part of where we are following in the Mishnah the ruling of the Torah and early rabbinic Judaism. Nowadays, there is still examination during menstruation in order to establish the final day of emission, and then to count clean days from that point forward. But as the Torah said, and as we talked about in the intro last week, in Deoraita from the Torah and early rabbinic Judaism, Niddah on the monthly cycle is 7 days, regardless of whether you bleed for 1 day or whether you bleed for 6 days. So there would be no point in checking. And as such, you don't need to check while you're actually menstruating. And likewise, if you have pure blood, which is, remember, the technical term for a woman that gave birth in that recent window, the 33, the day 8 to day 40, and trying to get the math right, day 15 to day 80 for a girl. During that period, we also don't need to have her check, because whatever is coming out is already considered to be tahor, to be ritually pure. And so what's the point of checking? So otherwise, even a very regular woman should be taking regular checks.
And what happens if a woman continue bleeding after the 7th day?
Well, then it's not considered to be a regular bleed. Then it's zava, and then you're going to count only once you get clean days. And obviously, this is only the ritual side of it. Of course, if a woman has an unexpected bleed, then she should absolutely be talking to her healthcare professional. But as far as halakha goes, then it gets resumed once that is taken care of, once the bleeding has stopped.
24 hours after the end, correct?
For the beginning of the counting, yeah.
No. After the last time that she was bleeding is 24. Bleeding is 24 hours, correct?
To begin counting clean days, yes.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
I think so. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So let's talk about the testing a little bit. She should also use testing rags when she has marital intercourse, except when she is sitting over a pure blood or when she is a virgin whose blood is clean. So pure blood, we already talked about. And please do remember, this is nothing like, eugenics, pure blood, that kind of, biology thing, genetics. Pure blood here means the woman who gave birth recently, and any bleeding is considered to come from the birth just for a long time, and it's not considered to be menstrual. Here, though, the virgin means an actual sexual virgin, and likewise, in the immediate aftermath of the loss of her virginity, we also assume that any blood that is found in that area is coming from the loss of virginity, not from menstruation. On the other hand, if she is not one of those two categories, then a woman should examine herself around the time of marital intercourse. We'll go into that in more detail. It's technically before and after, in order to make sure that they are not going to violate that other mitzvah. You may remember, again, from our introduction last week, that there are sort of two mitzvahs involved here. One is the mitzvah that if she is in the process of having the menstruation or other types of discharge, she becomes ritually impure, and that has implications. But the second mitzvah is that she and her husband should not be having intercourse. So they want to make sure that she's not in the midst of Niddah before she starts having sex. Because if she is, even if she wasn't aware of it, then, they accidentally, yes, but they still did break the mitzvah. So she checks beforehand to make sure that that's not going to happen. And she checks afterwards, because sometimes the action of intercourse can create the movement of menstruation. And twice daily, she should examine herself in the morning and at the evening twilight, and also when she is about to have sexual relations. So this is now the woman who doesn't have the regular period. She is not in that Veset category, and she needs to make sure sort of all the time that she's checking. That it's not just, regularly. It needs to be morning and then evening, and it needs to be before and after sex, because she is not predictable. And since the implications for ritual impurity are very straightforward, we need to make sure that that's not a concern. And then we have one final additional consideration: priestly women. That is to say, women that are part of a Kohen's household, either the daughter of a Kohen or the wife of a Kohen, are subject to an additional restriction. For they should examine themselves when they are going to eat truma. Remember, truma is the special gifts given to the Kohanim that has to be eaten while ritually pure, and the food itself is ritually pure. So obviously she needs to check to make sure that she is able to eat because she's ritually pure, and that she doesn't render the truma ritually impure because of that condition. Rabbi Yehuda says these must examine themselves also after they have concluded eating truma. He wants to add in a additional stringency that after eating, they should also do a double check to make sure nothing retroactively would be applied to the truma that was just eaten, any of the leftovers, if you will. But he is the minority voice on that. All right, we went a little bit over time. I hope you can forgive me. But I wanted to make sure we could finish chapter 1, because it's going to be my vacation time starting next week. So the 21st, 28th, the 5th, and the 12th, I will be away and class will be on pause. So we will pick up with chapter 2 when I get back.
See you on Shabbat. Bye-bye.
See you on Shabbat. Yes. Aaron?
Yeah, I had a quick question. When Natan said if you have the bleed on the 8th day, then you just have to be clean for another day before you can go in the mikvah, right? It's only after
Let's leave that until we get later into more of the halakha. Right now, we're sort of doing the basic level, and I don't want to introduce too many wrinkles until we get later on, because it's people will get remember things in the wrong order.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
But it's a great question, but just keep that for later in the Masechet.
All right.